Good evening and welcome to the Indian Law Institute for this event co-hosted between the Indian Law Institute and Jindal Global University, as well as the Centre for India-Australia Studies. We are delighted to have with us today two distinguished members of the judiciary. One has flown from Australia, Justice Michael Kirby, former High Court judge, and we have Justice Chandrachud here from the Supreme Court of India, somewhat of a shorter distance than Australia, but we're equally grateful for his participation this evening during this event. I would like to also acknowledge the presence of Salman Khurshid, former Minister of External Affairs of India and Senior Advocate of the Supreme Court of India, and of course Mr. Chris Elstoff, the Deputy High Commissioner of Australia, for being here this evening as well. To get the ball rolling, I'd like to invite the founding Vice-Chancellor of OP Jindal Global University, Dr. C. Raj Kumar, to say a few words. Thank you very much.
Institute, the OP Jindal Global University, the Centre for India-Australia Studies, as well as the Jindal Global Law School, to all of you for this distinguished public lecture. We're very fortunate that Justice Michael Kirby has accepted to deliver this lecture, and we're also grateful to the Indian Law Institute and Dr. Manoj Kumar Sinha, its director, for partnering with us to host this lecture. In fact, we're also very excited about the fact that Honorable Dr. Justice Chandrachud, Judge of the Supreme Court of India, had accepted to preside over this lecture on a working day when obviously he's busy both for today's matters as well as tomorrow's matters. So thank you so much for being here. It's a very special occasion because of the fact that Justice Michael Kirby is no stranger to India and to Indian jurisprudence. He has very closely worked with some of the distinguished jurists in our country. He spent most part of the day at our campus and reflected about his long association with India. I discovered the fact that way back in 1969, Justice Kirby visited my hometown where I was born, Kanyakumari, and drove across India for 4 months and discovered India through that process. And of course, in the last 50 years, has had very close associations with many judges, lawyers, academic institutions, as well as other jurists. He is passionately committed to the India-Australia collaboration, as well as many forms of engagement and interaction between Indian jurists as well as Australian jurists. We also very fortunate that this lecture is organized in the context of the visit of nearly 40 Australian students who are also present here. They are visiting our campus as a part of an India immersion program, and they also are in a position to visit this institution and to interact with some of you, both our students as well as faculty members. I also want to take a moment to recognize the importance of India-Australia relationship. Earlier in the day, we discussed about the need for building a strong collaboration between both our countries. Historically, this collaboration has been limited to the conversation surrounding cricket, but there is much more to the India-Australia relationship, and not only because of the fact that we both are shared democracies, having strong commitment to issues relating to freedom and democracy and rule of law, as well as justice, but even more than that, there is a very strong commitment to a presence within the Asia-Pacific region, looking at the future of India and Asia, how India is inevitably going to play a very significant role, and how it's important for Australia to engage with Indian academic institutions as well as democratic institutions. This visit of Justice Michael Kirby is also part of the effort to bring the Centre for India-Australia Studies that was established at OP Jindal Global University some time ago under the leadership of Professor Sean Starr to have a stronger focus on the India-Australia relationship. We have already built a number of relationships across the leading universities in Australia as a part of our commitment towards advancing knowledge creation and collaboration. These programs that we've built across nearly 10 universities in Australia is already bearing fruit. The inward mobility of Australian students into India and the mobility of Indian students, Jindal students to Australia has taken place over the last few years. We have built a number of collaborations with the leading Australian universities, including conferences, workshops, seminars, lectures, and student exchange and faculty exchange programs. We are also very fortunate that this collaboration is strongly supported by the Australian Embassy, and I'm grateful to your presence. The Australian High Commissioner as well as the Deputy High Commissioner have been very strongly supportive. In fact, the Centre for India-Australia Studies was inaugurated by the Australian High Commissioner, and I'm grateful to them for their support. I'm also grateful to the support of many individuals who are present here. I mentioned a few minutes ago that Mr. Salman Khurshid, I feel that he was much more engaged with our institution as a minister when he visited our campus thrice. And since he left that and become a lawyer, it's far more difficult to catch him. Obviously, billable hours makes a huge difference in his time. So I am trying to get his time to bring him to campus, and he promised to, give a course. But more than that, he has been a strong champion and supporter of our institution. I see Mr. Anand Groer, Indra Jaisingh, and Justice Kannan, and many others who are present on this occasion to hear Justice Michael Kirby and Justice Chandrachud. I am grateful to them for their support to the UP Jindal Global University and Jindal Global Law School. And lastly, I want to mention that it is these conversations and lectures and workshops that we do together help us understand some of the big issues relating to constitutional law, both in terms of its importance to the strengthening of the democratic fabric of both our countries, but also understanding to what extent comparative constitutional law can help us inform the decision-making processes of our institutions. With those words, I would like to request Sean Starr to formally introduce the speaker for this occasion, Justice Michael Kirby. Thank you very much.
Might be perhaps the first time that the Indian Law Institute has had more Australians in this room than Indians. But it's indeed indicative of Justice Michael Kirby's reputation back home in Australia, and certainly in India as well. And just a few bits of trivia that I thought I wanted to bring to light when I was introducing Justice Michael Kirby today. One is that, unfortunately, and Justice Kirby said this 21 years ago when he delivered a speech in 1996 in New Delhi to a group of advocates, he said it's puzzling and indeed tragic that Indian and Australian lawyers don't know much about each other. And I hope that through these kind of lectures and indeed through the Centre for India-Australia Studies and through these immersion programs that we're running for 3 weeks with our fantastic group of Australian students, that narrative is changing over time. So I wanted to mention that in the High Court of Australia, so the UNSW professors, 10 of them came here in about 2 months ago and had a joint conference with Jindal Global Law School through the Centre for India-Australia Studies. And one of the papers presented during this conference was how regularly or how often does the Indian Supreme Court refer to Australian judgments, and vice versa, how often does the Australian High Court refer to Indian judgments. It was held, or rather found, that more than, or around 450 occasions, the Indian Supreme Court had referred to Australian cases in 444 different cases. On the flip side, there was about 39 Australian cases which referred to Indian case law. And there were a variety of reasons discussed here, but I won't get into that today. What I will mention, however, is that 68% of those cases that referred to Indian case law were by one judge in particular, and that judge is sitting before us today. I think this is a useful bit of trivia because it not only shows, and we could say all day what a friend of India Justice Michael Kirby is, but there's proof in the pudding that the respect that Justice Kirby holds for the Indian judiciary and the way that he has used that in and within the Australian judiciary is indicative for the law students here today, and certainly when we were practicing and studying in an Australian legal context, that was evident as well. So I won't spend too much of your time introducing Justice Michael Kirby. His reputation certainly precedes him, and I would like to welcome him to the stage to deliver the keynote address for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Raj Kumar, and I express thanks to you and your university for the wonderful initiatives it has taken to help strengthen and build more strongly the links between Australian lawyers and lawyers in India, between the judiciary in India and the judiciary in my country. I also thank Sean for his remarks, and I've actually brought Sean's book here, which is in the library at this institute, and which is an excellent book reviewing many of the areas of possible interaction between Australian law and Indian law. We have much to learn from each other, and we have neglected that study, and that neglect must end. I'm particularly grateful that Justice Chandrachud has come to this lecture today. I have the greatest of admiration and respect for him. His writing is world famous. He's been invited to Australia to give very important named lectures in Australia, and I'm proud to say that for many years he has been a friend, and he's a much admired jurist in India. I'm old enough to have known his father as Chief Justice of India and as a Justice of the Supreme Court of India, and he reminded me that when he came to my chambers in Sydney when I was serving on the High Court of Australia, I showed him a photograph I had taken when I was President of the Court of Appeal of New South Wales with the then serving Justices of the Supreme Court of India, including his father, who at the time was the Chief Justice of India. So that photograph is still in my chambers. I've passed from the great power of a Justice of the High Court of Australia to simply an ex, but I still have the photograph and very fond memories of his father as well as of him. I had the pleasure of meeting Justice Bhagwati when he came to Sydney when I was President of the Court of Appeal of New South Wales. I said to Justice Bhagwati, I'm working on a case. Do you mind, can you tell me of any leads in India relevant to the issue? The issue was, does an official in a modern state have to give reasons for important decisions that that official makes affecting the lives of citizens? There were common law decisions in England and in Australia and in other countries that said no, there's no obligation to give reasons. And Justice Bhagwati, with that tremendous enthusiasm he had, got quite excited, told me about the Maneka Gandhi case in India, told me about his writing on this issue and the writing of other justices of the Supreme Court of India and other courts in India, promised to follow it up, which he immediately did when he got back to India, and I then wrote my reasons. And in my reasons, I said, we live in democracies, we can learn from other countries with democratic systems of the rule of law, and we can learn beneficially. We are not living in an imperium, we are not living in an oppressive community, we are living in a place where laws are generally made by Parliament, and it is to be implied from the fact that Parliament has made a law giving a power to a donee of power, that that donee will act in a rational way, and where a decision is made affecting the lives of a citizen or other person in the community, that that person will give reasons, because that is to be implied to Parliament, that Parliament would expect that that be done. We didn't have a constitutional hook on which to hang the right, but we had part of the reasoning of the Indian judges that it is to be inferred that Parliament, a democratic Parliament, will expect that officials will act in a rational way and explain their decisions. I then wrote my reasons, and one of my colleagues in the Court of Appeal of New South Wales, Justice Priestley, a very good judge, agreed with me. And another judge, Justice Glass, a very fine judge, and in a way a sort of mentor to me, an older judge, wrote a contrary opinion. He said the common law has not provided a right to reasons, and if Parliament wants to do that, Parliament can do it, but the judges should stay their hand. And so the Court of Appeal of New South Wales, by 2-1, held that it is to be inferred in legislation that if a decision of an official affects an individual, and if that individual asks the reason for the decision, if the reasons haven't already been given, that they will be given, and that is to be imputed as implied in the action of a Parliament in a democratic society. I was rather pleased with myself with that case, and I wrote to Justice Bhagwati and I said I got one of my colleagues to agree with our reasons, and that is now going to be the law in New South Wales and probably throughout Australia. But an appeal struck, and the case was appealed to the High Court of Australia, and the case is Osmond against the Public Service Board, and the appeal went to the High Court of Australia, and they reversed the majority, and therefore my decision was cast into the rejected basket, and the opinion of Justice Glass prevailed. When I sat on the High Court of Australia for a period of 13 years, I sat there waiting patiently, with saint-like patience, for a case to come up back to the High Court of Australia so I could get the court to revisit the decision in Osmond. Of course, I didn't make up my mind of what that decision should be. I didn't form a final view on it. I waited for the case to happen, but in 13 years it never came, and therefore the decision in Osmond remains as it was stated back in 1986. But that little story is a story of an accidental encounter, a commonality of experience, a commonality of a passion for law and for just law, and a willingness to learn from one another. Justice Bhagwati certainly had that view, and I had that view, and that was the attempt that I made. And the fact that it failed on that occasion doesn't mean that it didn't succeed on many other occasions. And the moral of the story is we should keep our minds open for what we can learn. We should make allowance for the fact that sometimes social factors and local cultures and local legal provisions and constitutional provisions will suggest another outcome, but we should not be so proud of ourselves and so self-satisfied in the environment in which we work that as lawyers we are not open to rational argument and rational analogies from other societies, particularly societies like India and Australia, that in the law share so much with each other. If you think of the things that are similar between Australia and India and the things that are different, I just jotted down a few similarities and a few differences. In similarities, we're both constitutional democracies, and we have representative legislatures. We have a parliamentary system. We have a basically federal system of government. Our federations are not entirely identical. Both of them have tended towards enhancing the power of the federal legislature and the federal government. They tend to the central, but they are both federal systems of government. Both observe the rule of law, and both of them observe the principle that the law is ultimately declared by independent and uncorrupted judges. Each of our countries has a Supreme Court. In Australia, it's rather confusingly called the High Court of Australia. The actual words of the Constitution are, there shall be a federal Supreme Court to be named the High Court of Australia. But it's just a little confusing to countries that have high courts, which are under the Supreme Court, that in Australia the Supreme Court is, the High Court is higher than the Supreme Courts of the states. But we've got used to that appellation difference. Each of us has the responsible system of government. That is to say, the governments are formed in the legislature. We are not like the United States of America with the provision of the independent branch of the presidency. We have a head of government who is different from the head of state, and the head of government is the person who normally represents the party that has the majority in the lower house, or the person who has the confidence of the lower house, and that is a system that we share with India. Though India has a president, the Indian president is a person with important constitutional responsibilities, but is bound by the conventions of the Constitution to act on the advice of the ministers forming the government. We have very similar courtesies and traditions. We even wear very similar uniforms in court and out of court. In Australia, when I was president of the Court of Appeal, I wore a wig every day, and it's amazing how you get used to wearing such a weird and strange uniform, but you do. But now in Australia, almost in every jurisdiction, the wigs have gone, and we now dress in a way very similar to the Indian judiciary and lawyers. And our countries are both countries with a strong protection in the Constitution for a common market. Before ever there was a common market in Europe, before ever there was the European Union, there was a common market in India and a common market in Australia, and the Indian provision copied the Australian provision of Section 92. Trade, commerce and intercourse between the states shall be absolutely free. That adjective, absolutely, caused a lot of trouble, and a lot of lawyers made a lot of money out of absolutely. But absolutely free was sending a message both in India and Australia that you could have various protective laws, but they must operate in an environment that safeguarded the unified and absolutely free market of the nation. So that's a lot of things in common. In India, that's Article 301 of the Constitution. In Australia, it's Section 92 of the Constitution. But the words were identical and chosen in both countries for the same purpose, to strengthen the nation by strengthening the market. And that is as it has proved. The differences are numerous. India had a great struggle for its independence. Australia didn't have a big struggle. The problem in Australia was getting the colonists to agree amongst themselves, but eventually they do. We in Australia have a constitutional monarchy. The Queen of the United Kingdom is still the head of state of Australia, and an attempt to change that in 1999 did not succeed. In India, there are powers for establishing an emergency, and there's no similar power in the Australian Constitution. You can change the Australian Constitution, but it's extremely hard to do so. And the Constitution in Australia can be changed under Section 128, but it requires a double majority to pass a law changing the text of the Constitution into effect. This was a provision copied from Switzerland at the time in 1900, and that provision has been tested on 44 occasions, but only 8 cases have succeeded in changing the text. India adopted provisions for fundamental rights in its constitution. Australia did not. It does have a few isolated provisions for fundamental rights, but when in 1986 an attempt was made to extend those constitutional provisions so that they applied to state governments as well as to federal governments, the people of Australia, voting in the referendum, rejected that notion. Why you would want to reject a notion that extended protections to you in the states that you already enjoy in the federal sphere is difficult to understand, but it did indicate how constitutionally conservative the electors of Australia are when they have a vote on changing the text of the Constitution. There was a provision in the Constitution relating to Australian Aboriginals, but the Constitution was very negative. It was that the federal parliament could make laws for the people of a particular race, but not laws in relation to Aboriginals. And if in India you still have issues surrounding Dr. Ambedkar's great struggle in relation to caste, we in Australia still have very considerable issues of justice facing our relationship with the Indigenous people of the nation. And that is one of the issues that I now want to address. We don't have a great deal of time, and every case is a little story. It's a story of human beings who have brought their dispute to an independent court. And during my service on the High Court of Australia, I never read a single novel. That's a shameful thing to admit. But every day I had an appeal book. An appeal book was full of the stories of love and hate, of rage and anger, of murder and of misguided love. And so I didn't need novels because every day was a day with a story. And every day we lawyers practice, we have a story. And we're lucky to have a profession in which we are dealing with people's problems and dealing with them in accordance with law and independently and justly, we hope. I want to tell 3 stories from a constitutional background and think about them, hopefully with some analogies to the Indian situation. First, the issue of race and the issue of the Aboriginal people and the way in which they were treated in the Constitution. Section 51(26) of the Australian Constitution said the power of the Parliament of the Commonwealth shall be to make laws for the peace, order and good government of the Commonwealth with respect to people of any race other than the Aboriginal race in any state for whom it is deemed necessary to make a special law. Just reflect upon that provision. It's so 19th century in its language to make a law for an independent nation at the beginning of its journey as a nation on the basis of race, of deciding to deal differentially to people in the nation by reference to their race. One of the other initiatives that was taken by Well, I see the arrival of my old friend Soli Sarabji. Thank you for coming, Soli. It's lovely to see you here. Former Attorney General, Solicitor General of India. Justice Bhagwati took another important initiative in which I participated, and it was taken in Bangalore, and it related to the issue of the domestic application of international human rights law. And it produced the Bangalore Principles. And the Bangalore Principles state that if, as a judge or a lawyer, you're involved in a case, and the case doesn't have any specific law solving it, then in reaching the solution that you seek to arrive at for the law, it is permissible today for you to have regard to the international law of human rights. This was a principle that Justice Bhagwati was keen to advance, and a group of judges met in Bangalore, and one of those judges was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the later a justice and still a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States of America, and myself. And one of the principles which we expressed in the Bangalore rules was the principle that we could reach for international principles if we came to a case where we felt that something needed to be done, but we couldn't find an express, clear constitutional, statutory or other provision. And that issue was presented to the High Court of Australia in the case of Mabo against Queensland. This is an extremely important case. In Australian jurisprudence, in the High Court of Australia, you don't get more important. It was whether or not, after 150 years of having a legal principle in Australia that denied recognition of the indigenous peoples, the Aboriginal people's right to title to their land, the court would continue that old rule or would look to form a better rule, a more appropriate rule, a rule more in keeping with the fundamental principles of human rights. And in that case, the High Court of Australia, led on the occasion by Chief Justice Mason, and the leading opinion being written by Justice Brennan, said that the one principle of universal human rights that you can recognise with certainty, that is recognised by all civilised people, is that you cannot disadvantage a people by reference to their race. And that the law in Australia that denied the Aboriginal people access to the ownership of their land was a law that discriminated against them on the basis of their race. And that law, framed from an earlier time, could not be the law of a civilised nation and was no longer to be treated as the law of Australia. Now, every lawyer present in this room will know how the law of land is not an area of the law that you readily mess with. And people's right to land and competing claims of rights to land is an area of the law which needs great care in changing, because people's economic interests and their family interests and their inheritances are all bound up in it. But notwithstanding those reasons for caution, the High Court of Australia in Mabo against Queensland, 1992, 175 Commonwealth Law Reports at page 44, said that this was a principle which could not stand with universal human rights and had to be changed, and they changed it. And of course they were criticised and they were attacked. I wasn't on the court at the time, but it was a very important decision, and it grew out, I believe, of the discussion in Australia of the Bangalore Principles, which had been initiated by the meeting in Bangalore and by the initiative of Justice Bhagwati of India. So in that curious and roundabout way, this was a contribution not envisaged perhaps at the time it was made for the development of the law in my country. A second story relates to foreigners. Now, every country has some difficulties with foreigners, and Australia has had more than a few because of the fact we're on an island. There's something about island people. They keep seeing themselves on an island. They're surrounded by water, and there's a whole world beyond the island and the water that is, they think, trying to come at them and get into them, get over the water and into their country. And that leads to a certain hostility to people trying to get the benefits that the citizens have. Anyway, in Australia in recent times, another area where we have had difficulties has related to refugees, and it relates to the way in which we have treated refugees. A Labor government back in 1990 introduced the rule that any person who came to Australia seeking refugee status who did not have a visa to enter the country was then rendered liable to be arrested and detained and put in a detention camp until their claim to refugee status would be determined. This was a rule which is still in place, and it's a rule which has led to efforts to impose that stern requirement on people, men, women and children who come to Australia without a visa. The result is that steps have been taken in more recent times when people have been coming to Australia to claim refugee status under the Refugees Convention, to which Australia is a party, have found the vessels on which they're travelling, often makeshift vessels, arrested. They've been transferred to ships, and they've been taken to offshore processing places. There's something very disconcerting about the word of processing of human beings. One of the places was the island of Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, territorial waters, and another was the island of Nauru, at one stage a German colony, and then later a colony of mandated territory of Australia. This has led to people being detained there, not under an order of a court, but in the first instance under a decision of administrators and under the law as made by Parliament and under the actions of members of the executive government. And so challenges have been taken against this detention, which sometimes has gone on for years and years. And they came before me in the High Court of Australia, and I said, surely we don't have a power in the executive government to arrest people and hold them for years. Surely there has to be a limit to the amount of the detention. But the majority of the court, looking at the Migration Act, said, what is the problem you have with the word detained? They are detained because they've arrived without a visa, and they can be detained until they satisfy the requirements of the visa or they give up and leave. Recently, in a decision in the High Court of Australia, a number of the justices have begun to pick up an implication of the Constitution. There's no constitutional provision that says you can't keep people indefinitely, but they've begun to say, in Australia, we have an independent judiciary. The independent judiciary has certain responsibilities. The responsibilities include the responsibilities of punishment. The executive government can detain, but if the detention goes on too long, it runs the risk of changing into punishment. And if it is punishment, it can only be imposed by the courts. It can't be imposed by the executive or by an act of parliament. And this is something which is looking for the implications of constitutions. If you look at the Constitution as a legal document, it's bound to have implications. All documents have implications. Wills have implications, contracts between parties have implications, and constitutions, more than most documents, have implications because of the very nature of language and the need sometimes to flush out the express words that are stated. Now, another very great judge of India, Justice Khanna, who was a heroic judge in the Kesa Vandana case, said, talking of the implications of the Indian Constitution that led him ultimately to the basic structure doctrine of the Indian Constitution. This is what he explained. If the power of amendment in the Indian Constitution does not comprehend the doing away of the entire Constitution, but postulates retention or continuity of the existing Constitution, though in an amended form, the question arises as to what is the minimum of the existing Constitution which should be left intact in order to hold that the existing Constitution has been retained in an amended form and has not been done away with. That was the foundation of finding the implied provisions of the Constitution for the defence of the basic structure or framework of the Constitution. And similarly, in Australia, we can look into our Constitution and look to the basic structure of a Constitution that has an independent judiciary, which is there to ensure that people do not suffer indefinite detention as a result of the actions of the executive government or the Parliament itself. Now, the third story I want to talk about is a story relating to a minority, another minority. I've mentioned the minority of the Aboriginals. I've mentioned the minority of the people who come from different communities. And now I want to talk about a minority that I know well. And this is the minority of LGBTIQ, gays, we'll call them. I'm too old to call them queers, which is what young people do, but lesbians, gays, bisexual, transgender people. They exist in every country, they exist in every society, and they are citizens, and they are entitled to dignity and respect. In fact, it was my partner, Johan, who 50 years ago almost, 49 years ago, told me that we had to go on a journey to India. I said, why do we have to go on a journey? He said, I have a dream of India. I want to go on a journey to India. I want you to quit your work as a busy barrister, and I want you to take off a year and get a life and go in a combi van to the four corners of India and search out every part of that fascinating, mysterious country. And I said, but my career, my profession, my job, my fame, it'll be destroyed. And he said, no, it won't. It'll be all there when you want to go back. And meantime, we will have explored India. And as the Vice-Chancellor said, very soon after we arrived in what was then called Madras and drove down to Cape Kumari, we saw one of the great scenes of the world, the sunset at Cape Kumari. Just a magnificent place. The Vice-Chancellor tells me that when we went on a second trip, which was in 1974, he was just born. And I can swear I could hear a baby crying and screaming when we were in our combi van trying to concentrate on the beautiful sunset at Cape Kumari. And there was this baby screaming and crying, and it was Vice-Chancellor Rajkumar. But that partner, Johan, is still with me. He was there when I said goodbye to him in Sydney when I came up here to India. People have loved ones. People have partners. People have loving and supporting friends. It is, I have it on the authority of India Today, I think it's called. They've got this week's journal, and it says, how they work this out I don't know, that people who have partners are 10% happier than people who don't have partners. How they would work out that it's 10% and not 12% or not, I don't know, but it's definitely good for your health, it's good for your well-being, it's good for your support, and for lawyers it's good to have somebody who takes you down a peg or two and keeps your feet on the ground and tells you to get real and not to be unreal. Now, in Australia, we have had many problems getting rid of the colonial laws which we inherited against gays. Every country where the Union Jack ever flew, and that includes the United States of America, every country where the British ever were got horrible laws against gays. You know, I think they're very similar to attitudes on the basis of caste. It's taking a group in society, casting them down and disadvantaging them and disrespecting them as equal human beings. But in any case, the law was horrible, and it took a long time for us to get rid of the criminal laws, and it was eventually done by 1997 in Tasmania. The little island at the bottom of Australia hung out to the bitter end, but eventually they also changed their laws. But that didn't finish the struggle against discrimination against gay people, and including on the basis of their relationships. I gather the microphone has gone off. Well, here it's back on again. I think there might be somebody who doesn't agree with what I'm saying. But I'm used to that. So in Australia, the government said, oh, this is a very, very hot issue. No, we've got to have a referendum. We've got to have a plebiscite on this matter. And the net result of that was they were seeking to have the referendum or the plebiscite because in Australia, the citizens always vote against the plebiscite. The net result of that was that they said, we've got to have the plebiscite first. But the Senate in Australia twice rejected the law for a plebiscite and twice rejected the vote of the money, the citizens' money, for the $125 million that was required to conduct the plebiscite. But then the government said, well, we can't get the vote through, we can't get the appropriation for it, but we will use an emergency power for the minister to authorise the appropriation of money. Now, in the Australian Constitution, as in the Indian Constitution, there's a very, very important and historical provision, and it's designed to protect the spending of the people's money. It's called the appropriation power. In Australia, it's found in section 83 of the Constitution, and it says, 81 says all monies received from the taxpayers have to be paid into a consolidated revenue fund. And 83 says no money shall be drawn from the Treasury of the Commonwealth except under appropriation made by law. And that's almost word for word Article 114 of the Indian Constitution. It's a very fundamental principle. And so the government said we're going to use this emergency power, and the opponents said there's no emergency. This is simply trying to have a vote of the people outside Parliament, and that should not happen without the vote of Parliament. Parliament had rejected it twice. But the High Court of Australia held that in this case it was arguably an emergency, and so the postal survey took place, and the postal survey resulted in a vote not against the marriage equality provision, but in favour. And the vote was ultimately a vote of 66% in favour and 33% against. So out of the manoeuvrings came a silver lining, and as a result of that decision, the change was made in Australia, and the law was passed by overwhelming majorities. And so, at long last, LGBT people are treated equally in Australia, and the law is now coming into effect. Now, in India, you have had many similar difficulties. The difficulties are evidenced in the heroic and wonderful decision of Justice A.P. Shah in the Delhi High Court in the Naz Foundation case, and I pay tribute to my old friend Anand Grover at the back of the hall today, who was leading advocate in that case. A beautifully crafted decision, if I can say so. I'm not going to ask Justice Chandrachud to say or comment in any way on this, and I'm being very careful not to put a step as a foreigner out of line in a matter which is still before the courts. And it's important that the rights of the courts to decide these matters independently and impartially should be respected and preserved. Kaushal, like my decision in Osmond, but much more importantly, was reversed. And the reversal has now been the subject of a corrective petition and of other steps that are being taken in the courts, and ultimately it will be determined in India in the way these things are determined in the court by legal decision. But can I say what a surprise it was to me to read Kaushal. I was on my way to India, to the University of Calcutta, still so named, to deliver the Tagore Lectures, which is a famous series of law lectures that have been going strong in India since 1870. And then suddenly I found that the land had been cut from under my feet, and Kaushal had come down to change it. But what a pleasure it was for me to read the reasons of Justice Chandrachud. In his recent decision in the privacy case, where he responded to the two main actual reasons advanced by the Supreme Court in Kaushal, namely that this was a matter for Parliament, and secondly, that it was only affecting a minuscule minority and that didn't affect them very much either. Justice Chandrachud said, neither of the above reasons in Kaushal can be regarded as a valid constitutional basis for disregarding a claim based on privacy under Article 21 of the Constitution that a, quote, minuscule fraction of the country's population constitutes lesbians, gays, bisexuals and transgenders is not a sustainable basis to deny a right to privacy. the purpose of elevating certain rights to the stature of fundamental guaranteed rights is to insulate their exercise from the disdain of majorities, whether legislative or popular. The guarantee of constitutional rights does not depend upon their exercise being favourably regarded by majoritarian opinion. The test of popular acceptance does not furnish a valid basis to disregard rights which are conferred with the sanctity of constitutional protection. Discrete and insular minorities face grave dangers of discrimination for the simple reason that their views, beliefs, or way of life does not accord with the, quote, mainstream, unquote. Yet in a democratic constitution founded on the rule of law, their rights are sacred as those conferred on any other citizens to protect their freedoms and liberties. Those are words that will be read in 100 years. Those are words that speak of the fundamental values of constitutionalism, of respecting the separate, particular, and sacred duties of courts to uphold the fundamental rights of the citizens. And as a citizen of another country, I think it is not inappropriate for me to share with you my experience. Many people say they've never met a gay person. Many people say we don't know them, we don't much like them, aren't they always dancing and prancing around and so on? Well, there are gay judges, there are gay lawyers, there are gay military, there are gay hairdressers, there are gay people in all walks of life and in every society. And there are young gays and beautiful gays, and there are old gays and, well, not so beautiful old gays. But people are people. Human beings are human beings. And one of the proudest things we can say about the judiciary of India and Australia is that given the tools and given the provisions, they will fiercely, with independence and with integrity, uphold the rights of all. Equal justice under law is not something we just carve into the portals of courthouses. It's something we carve onto our hearts, and it's something which is very strongly stated in the passage I've just read to you. And as a human being and as a citizen of another country, I'm very proud to be a member of the legal profession which does good, wise, just and kind things like that, treating everybody equal, equal justice under the law.